Hey friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to talk about all of my favorite reads of 2022. Like I've mentioned in previous videos, I had a pretty lame reading year and I didn't really have that many 5-star reads. And so unlike last year where I had a favorite nonfiction and a favorite fiction and I made separate videos, I'm just clumping all of my favorite books in today's video, but I'm categorizing them by genre because I have some books that stood out for me in each category. Feel free to skip around if you want. I'll have best picture books, best graphic novels, contemporary, thriller, mystery, classics, nonfiction, and historical fiction. So those are my categories. I will name my favorite read of that category as well as other books that really worked well for me. So let's start off with picture books. I mentioned that I fell in love with picture books in my What I Learned About my reading year in 2022, and they're wonderful palette cleansers, and I found some fun standouts that had a really perfect combination of beautiful art and fun storytelling just combined together, put a smile on my face. So I'm going to mention a stack of my favorite picture books out of the 70 that I read in 2022. Starting off with Little Witch Hazel by Phoebe Wall. I read a few of her books and she is a beautiful illustrator. This one is about a little witch that lives in the forest and it highlights the 4 seasons and her friends and different adventures that she goes on, and it was just really lovely. Rain Before Rainbows was a beautiful picture book that was bright and colorful and had a really good message as well. Hello Lighthouse read almost like a nonfiction picture book on how lighthouses work and a particular family that lived in the lighthouse. It also had really beautiful illustrations and storytelling. B, A Peek Through a Picture Book by Britta Teckentrup. This author has a ton of books in the series that have cutouts in them. They go through the whole book. This one is all about a bee and a bee's journey and a bee's life. Winter Bees is a collection of poetry about winter, and it was also very lovely nature poetry writing and beautiful illustrations. My top 3 picture books actually all made me smile and laugh. They were quite funny. First one of the 3 being A Visitor for Bear by Bonnie Becker. This is a series about a bear and a mouse and an unlikely friendship, and it was just really sweet, really clever, made me laugh. Another picture book that had me cracking up is We Found a Hat by John Klassen. Actually, John Klassen was one of my top authors of the year because I read like 4 or 5 of his books. This is a series, a trilogy of books about animals and a hat, and it's very funny, dry, kind of sarcastic, really silly. Genuinely made me laugh out loud, and that was a fun surprise. And finally, at the top of the list, my favorite picture book that I read in the entire year of 2022 out of like the 70 plus was Mel Fell by Corey R. Tabor. This was a surprising picture book. It was a delight to read. It's also a really fun format because you read it this way, like this, rather than like this. It has a bit of a twist. It made me laugh, it made me smile. I genuinely cannot wait to read this book with a future child someday. Next up, the best graphic novels. I read 24 graphic novels in the year 2022, and I'll talk about 2 that really worked for me. The first one being Ballad for Sophie by Felipe Melo. This is a historical fiction adult graphic novel about a man who was a pianist, and it is his life story. He's telling his story to a younger person and reliving it. I actually really like that trope. It doesn't always work, but it really worked well in this graphic novel. The illustrations are also gorgeous, and a beautiful addition to this book is at the end of it there's a code that you can scan and a song that you can play while reading the book, a piano song that was written to accompany the story. Really well done, very clever. I will warn you that this is a very adult graphic novel, so there is language, there is nudity and sex scenes drawn and depicted. It's not over the top or gratuitous, overdone, it just is included. So for those that like to avoid that, this might not be for you. This was a gorgeous story of redemption and family, and I really loved it. But my first place winner for graphic novels is a children's fantasy middle grade. Who am I? But that was Lightfall, The Girl and the Guldurian by Tim Probert. This one surprised me. I didn't really expect to hit me like it did. It was beautiful. The illustration style is gorgeous, and the whimsy behind the storytelling is an aspect of adventure and found family and a quest, and it was absolutely a delight to read. It is a series. The series isn't as good as this first book, but this one was such a fun find. The next category is contemporary, and surprisingly both books have Alice in the title. The honorable mention is Still Alice by Lisa Genova. This is a read that lives up to the hype. It's definitely a book that I've seen around. I know there's a movie. I know it's about Alzheimer's, but it was so well done. It was also really hard to read. You're in the mind space of someone who cannot remember things and their life seems to be falling apart around them and how that impacts the family. And it was just so well done. I'm so intrigued to try more from this author. I thought that this was a really amazing book. But my crowning winner for contemporary is What Alice Forgot by Leanne Moriarty. She's an author that I've just had success reading from, and this one was no exception. This is about a young woman who wakes up from a fall with amnesia. She doesn't remember the last 10 years of her life. Her marriage has fallen apart. She has really bad friendships. She has fraught relationships with her family, and she doesn't understand how all of that happened because the last thing she remembers is that she was happily married and everything was perfect in her life. So she's really on a journey to uncover why she changed so much in 10 years and what went wrong. And the thing I love about this author is how she unpacks some questions about like, what would I do in that situation? How would I feel about that? She really unpacks like human emotion so well and family dynamics. And this one was just a delight to read. I read it in like a day, couldn't put it down. It was really fun. The next category is best thriller / mystery. First one being The Life We Bury by Alan Eskins. This is a start of a series about a young man, Joe Talbert, who is a college-age student writing an assignment, an essay about someone in a nursing home, and he discovers this man who was put on death row for a crime that he did not commit. So he jumps into investigating this crime. There's also family dynamics that are at play. This was also just a surprising read, a really well done mystery, and I haven't picked up the series since reading this one, but I would love to continue it. The winner for thriller though should be no surprise because I've talked about this book quite a bit, and that is 3 Hours by Rosamund Lupton. This was so much more than just your average thriller. It really unpacks a ton of stuff. The book covers 3 hours on a snowy blizzard day amidst a school shooting. There are tons of perspectives in this, from police to parents to students to teachers to the gunman. It was complex and so smart. I was very impressed by this author and how she wove this story together. In a fairly short amount of space, she packed a punch with this thriller, and I would highly recommend. Next up is best classic. I read 29 classics, and unfortunately this was the only 5-star one. I read some that were 4 stars that were pretty good and decent, but this one really was the creme de la creme, and I'm so glad it lived up to my expectations because I am such a fan of the 2005 movie adaptation of it. Don't hate on me, I understand the 90s one is way closer to the book, but I still love the 2005 one just for the cinematography alone. I am talking about Pride and Prejudice, of course, by Jane Austen. This was my first exposure to the written word of Jane Austen, and I absolutely loved it. I loved getting to dive into this book and getting more of a backstory and understanding of the characters that I already know and love from the movie adaptation, and I was so pleasantly surprised by how funny this was and how smart it was as well. So I'm happy to report that it worked well for me. Okay, so moving right along, we have best nonfiction. I have 7 books to mention. I definitely had the hardest time trying to rank these of which ones I loved more than others, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start with a book that surprised me. It is so much more than just a cookbook. Kachka, A Return to Russian Cooking by Bonnie Frumpkin Morales. This was actually a Christmas gift last year, 2 years ago now, and I was just expecting this to be, you know, your average cookbook with some fun recipes and some fun photographs, but it was so much more than that. Before every recipe, there is about a paragraph or two where the author gives some information, some history behind the dish, or how it relates to her family, and I come from a Russian background, so I just found this so relatable. Food is such an essential and important part of the Russian culture, and so I just loved having some background on some dishes that I grew up having and loving, and also getting to know the author a little bit more. She is a chef actually of a fine dining Russian restaurant in Portland, Oregon, and this was just a delightful cookbook. On a very similar note, I read Mastering the Art of Soviet Cooking, a memoir of food and longing by Anya von Bremzen. The author was born in 1963 in Soviet Russia, and she tells a story of her grandmother and mother growing up in the Soviet Union and her story as well. Like I mentioned, food is such an essential part of the culture, and so she tells that story mostly through food and recipes. This was a very beautiful and interesting perspective of what growing up in the Soviet Union was like and how very harsh it was. Since I'm talking about an international country, up next I'll mention A Fine Romance, Falling in Love with the English Countryside by Susan Branch. This is one of those books that hit me in the right place at the right time. It was September, I had just come home from a 2-week trip to the UK, and this was just that. A woman and her husband go on a 2-month adventure to the English countryside, and it was like a scrapbook travel diary. She hand wrote the entire book. She included photographs and watercolor painting. It was just incredibly relatable and wholesome and just a lovely read. If you are someone who loves to travel or is at all interested in the English countryside, I would highly recommend. Speaking of travel, the next one on the list is The Day the World Came to Town, 9/11 in Gander, Newfoundland by Jim DeFeed. This one was a delightful read. It will give you hope and humanity. So during the 9/11 terrorist attacks, airspace closed down in the US, and all of these planes were rerouted to Gander, Newfoundland, a tiny town where people came together to take care of thousands of people who were stranded for days. It was also wonderful to get a different glimpse of how 9/11 impacted a very different city. I heard that there's maybe a play or a musical based on this story, and I would love to see that one day. Next up is a book that I'm not surprised made it to the top lists, and that is The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. This book I always recommend to those that read and loved Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, because Bryan Stevenson mentioned Anthony Ray Hinton in his book. Hinton is a young black man who gets wrongfully accused of a crime, gets put on death row and solitary confinement for 30 years, and this is his story of dealing with that trauma, that anger, those years that he lost. He touches on his faith and then ultimately coming to acceptance of his circumstances and how he befriended his fellow inmates and created space in prison and created relationships there. This was beautiful and hopeful and tragic, and how wonderful for a man to overcome all of the odds and lives through it and tells his story. This next one was also a delightful surprise, and that is The Lost Spells by Robert McFarlane and Jackie Morris. This is a beautiful collection of nature poetry. It's also filled with some gorgeous watercolor painting inside as well, paired alongside with some poems, and it touches on poems about plants and animals and nature and seasons, and it just really gave me an appreciation for nature, made me want to stop, pause, go outside, and just be present and observe nature. It is a cozy, wonderful, delightful read. Definitely one that I will return to time and time again, and that I love having on my shelves. And finally, at the very top of the list, the one that I'm gonna count the best nonfiction. I mean, all of those were great, but this one just was so emotionally impacting. I still think about it. It just made me weep. And the books that, you know, hit me in the heart are the ones that really stay with me. And I am talking about Penguin the Magpie, the Odd Little Bird Who Saved a Family by Cameron Bloom. It's a quick read because every page has a photograph and then a paragraph, and Cameron Bloom tells the story of his family. He's the father. Him and his wife and their two sons went on vacation. The mother had an accident and fell and became paralyzed. Around the same time, one of their sons finds an injured magpie bird outside, and they decide to bring it in and rehab it and nurture it. And this was just a beautiful story, also full of hope and redemption and overcoming odds. And there's some lovely photographs in here. They add so much to the story. I feel like I got to know this family. Ultimately made me weep in the best way. Just hit me right in the heart. What a lovely experience, one that I will think about for a long time. All right, so let's end with the best historical fiction, starting with A Well-Behaved Woman by Therese Ann Fowler. This is a book about Alva Vanderbilt, a woman who made her place in the world even though the circumstances were against her. This is all about Gilded Age, high society New York City, and the architecture of New York and family life. I really enjoy this one for the historical perspective and understanding a woman like Alva Vanderbilt. It was surprisingly easy and fast to read, even though it is not the thinnest of books. This is one of those books that is the exception to the rule. I usually do not like books about kind of morally gray, unlikable characters and infidelity, and those themes are definitely explored in this book. Very imperfect, flawed characters, but I still really enjoyed it. So there's that, and it got me excited to read more books kind of set during this Gilded Age. Another historical fiction I really enjoyed is The Gown by Jennifer Robson. This is a story of friendship and the perspective of three women, two of them being embroiderers that embroidered the flowers on Queen Elizabeth's wedding gown. So it is mainly set post-World War II England, and the country is still on rations. People are still reeling with the effects of the war. I enjoyed it, that historical perspective. I also really liked the perspective of the fashion industry and the story of friendship and resilience. Another one that I really enjoyed that is getting all the love and hype is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis. This book wasn't perfect, but it was a really fun read that also dealt with really heavy topics and themes, particularly around sexual abuse and patriarchy and women being dismissed in their careers. It was also surprisingly light and comedic and very quirky. It has a very memorable character, Elizabeth Zott, and I don't remember characters' names really well, but I still think about her and I still think about this book. This next book is by an author that I love. I've read all of her books, and this one also was an excellent one, released in 2022, and that is I Must Betray You by Ruta Sepetys. This one is set in Romania in 1989 during the revolution, kind of the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the main perspective is from a teenage boy. He becomes an informant on his family because he is forced to do so. I really loved learning about some Romanian history and a perspective that I just really wasn't aware of before. And again, Ruta Sepetys, she does no wrong. This next historical fiction was such a delight to read, and it is middle grade. That is A Place to Hang the Moon by Kate Albus. This is about three siblings who remind me a lot of the three siblings in Narnia, and they are forced to the English countryside during the London Blitz to be safe. They are recently orphaned, their grandmother dies. They actually have a ton of money but are told to keep it secret, and kind of on a quest to go find a new family. Of course, the family that they're placed with aren't really nice or kind to them, and then there are other characters and people in town that learn to care for them and that they create bonds with. It was just such a lovely story of found family and siblings, and again, overcoming hardship. What a delightful and pleasant read. Very reminiscent of The War I Saved My Life, but definitely less heavy on the themes that were explored in that book. And finally, my top two historical fictions of this year are both by the same author. I'll mention the one I liked a little bit less than the top one. Amy Harmon is the author. This one is What the Wind Knows. This is supposed to be kind of similar to Outlander but set in Ireland. Has an aspect of time travel in it. There's definitely some romance, but really the heart of the story is about a woman in Ireland and how she gets swept up in this revolution and this story, the relationship that she has with her grandfather. There's a lot of aspects to the story and it's actually quite hard to explain, so I just recommend kind of going in blind and being swept away in it. I loved learning about some Irish history that was explored in here, and just the way that the author put the story together between letters and the different character perspectives. I really enjoyed this one, kind of was along for the ride. It didn't quite beat out Where the Lost Wander, but it was still a fantastic book, and I'm just so excited to dive into more of Amy Harmon's backlist. But my top historical fiction of 2022 was The Unknown Beloved. This is Amy Harmon's newest released from 2022, and this one also deals with multiple things. There is a bit of an element of fantasy in it, but it's not overdone or takes the story away. The heart of the story is really a mystery thriller. You're trying to figure out who the serial killer is, and this one also felt the most romance heavy out of the Amy Harmons that I've read. There's a detective and a young woman and they team up together to solve this crime. I just was swept away by it, and the characters, I was rooting for them. I was in the story. I wanted to know what happened. I just loved my time in it. This is also set during the 1930s in Cleveland, Ohio, which is not a usual time and place for me to read about in historical fiction, so I loved that as well. If you haven't read an Amy Harmon, please do so. Where the Lost Wander is still my favorite, but this one is a close second. So those are all of the best books of 2022. I read 270 books, and those are the rough, I don't know, 20 best ones. Like I keep saying, 2023 is the year I am due for some fun reads that I'm going to love. So please let me know what your absolute favorite #1 book was in 2022 that you loved. And what do you think of my list? Do any of those sound interesting enough to you to want to pick up? Let me know if you do decide to read them and what your thoughts were. Thank you all so much for watching and tuning in today, and I will see you in another video soon. Bye!